I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestionable.
I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, and their loyalty is unquestionably profound. The pen touched the paper for only a few seconds, yet the heavy consequences stretched far across 70 years of royal history. King Charles did not announce a sudden abdication, abolish an ancient title, or surrender the crown. Instead, he signed the instrument of royal household closure, the final, decisive order dissolving Queen Elizabeth II's remaining household, retiring its last remaining appointments, and transferring its sealed responsibilities directly into his own reign. With that single signature, her legendary era officially ended, transforming living history into immutable memory before the eyes of a watching world. Charles kept his hand hovering above the expensive vellum page, hesitating as if lifting it up might somehow make the irreversible decision unhappen. The instrument of royal household closure was a formal, uncompromising command designed to end the administrative offices that had continued operating in his mother's name long after her physical passing. It retired their final appointments, transferred their protected archives, and permanently closed financial accounts that had been carefully maintained during the turbulent change of reign. This was never routine paperwork. It meant the massive machinery of Elizabeth's lifelong service would never act again. Camilla watched his fingers tighten anxiously around the pen. The Queen Consort had long desired one single working household, one clear chain of command, and zero lingering confusion over who carried absolute authority. Yet, she felt no sense of victory as she saw him staring intently at Elizabeth's royal cipher, the personal emblem used to mark a sovereign's official papers. She understood instantly that the king was not hesitating over mere administration. He was quietly grieving as a son forced to close his beloved mother's final door. The profound silence within the room concealed an even deeper institutional struggle. A highly sensitive documented account prepared for the Privy Council, the senior advisory body to the sovereign, revealed that the closure order had actually been ready for months. Charles had reviewed it, deliberately delayed it, and returned it in signed time and time again. Each instance, one specific, stubborn clause had stopped him in his tracks. It transferred sole, undivided authority over several sealed boxes of Elizabeth's private constitutional correspondence directly and exclusively to him. Camilla lowered her eyes when a senior aide quietly entered the room to collect the completed document. Those mysterious boxes contained intensely private exchanges protected for decades by loyal officials who had served the late monarch, and their transfer would place precious memories, sharp warnings, and unfinished instructions entirely under her son's solitary control. The aide nervously reached for the thick file, but Charles held onto the corner for one final, agonizing second before finally releasing it. That small, telling resistance said everything he could not articulate aloud. Princess's telephone rang loudly before the file had even left the physical boundaries of Buckingham Palace. The Princess Royal listened intently without interrupting once, then asked bluntly, "He has signed all of it?" Her voice hardened instantly, though deep, unmistakable shock moved beneath the surface. She ended the call abruptly and remained completely motionless, already understanding with chilling clarity which sealed correspondences were now permanently beyond her protective reach, and knowing full well that Charles would soon have to face her wrath. The signature might have legally ended one royal household, but inside the intimate walls of the family, it reopened an old wound that had never truly healed. For the general public, the document merely represented procedural necessity, but for the people who had lived and worked beneath Elizabeth's formidable authority for decades, it felt painfully like a second funeral. Charles had signed the paper strictly as sovereign, but he reacted purely as a grieving son, and received the breaking news as a daughter, losing the final working trace of her mother's daily presence. William saw it as a necessary, unavoidable transfer of heavy responsibility, while Camilla understood that the old structure's sudden disappearance would fundamentally alter how every future royal decision was judged by history. Charles remained standing beside the heavy mahogany desk long after the signed order had been physically removed. The king knew deep down that his reign could not possibly remain dependent on offices carrying his mother's authority, because competing instructions could easily divide loyal staff and fatally weaken public accountability. Yet, ending those offices felt brutally, personally cruel. Each closed account, retired appointment, and transferred responsibility seemed to maliciously erase another sign that Elizabeth had once worked tirelessly within those historic walls. Camilla approached him with extreme caution, knowing the emotional minefield. The Queen Consort had staunchly supported a single royal household, a unified operation in which every official answered exclusively to the reigning monarch. But she fully understood the immense emotional price attached to it. She gently told Charles that pointlessly delaying the closure could never genuinely preserve his mother in amber. Charles turned sharply toward her, the words striking him not as comforting reassurance, but as a harsh demand to finally release the extraordinary woman whose towering example had shaped his entire life. Camilla immediately softened her voice, realizing she had accidentally touched a well of profound grief he rarely allowed anyone else to witness. Miles away, and sat entirely alone at Gackham Park, holding an old, heavily worn handwritten schedule marked meticulously with Elizabeth's familiar corrections. The Princess Royal slowly traced one neat line with her thumb, and felt a surge of hot anger rise directly beneath her heavy sorrow. Palace officials had routinely described the closure as a cold administrative necessity, but to her, it looked painfully like bereavement dressed up in sterile official language. Her mother's final working structure had vanished with the stroke of a pen, and not a single person had afforded her the basic decency of saying a proper goodbye. William faced an entirely different, complex burden. As the Prince of Wales, the formal title given to the person first in line to inherit the throne, he firmly believed the modern monarchy desperately needed one clear, undisputed chain of authority. Overlapping, competing offices created dangerous confusion, protected outdated rivalries, and allowed instructions from a previous reign to obstruct crucial decisions made by the current sovereign. Still, he knew administrative efficiency could never serve as a valid excuse for emotional cruelty. When he discovered Anne's name was suspiciously missing from the official consultation record, his confidence in the process began to fracture. A confidential private memorandum preserved the very first warning of the brewing storm. Elizabeth had originally assigned separate, temporary responsibilities to each of her children, fully expecting those vital duties to survive during the delicate transition period following her passing. Charles had received sensitive constitutional papers and had been solemnly entrusted with delicate family correspondence. Edward had inherited ceremonial commitments, and Andrew's role had been sharply, deservedly limited. Yet one crucial duty had remained entirely unresolved: the strict supervision of a sealed historical archive concerning the Crown's future conduct. William read the memo twice, and a documented note attached to it confirmed a devastating truth, and had been explicitly promised a formal meeting before any household closure order was ever authorized. No such meeting had ever occurred, and no official explanation had been recorded anywhere. Someone within the inner circle had deliberately allowed Charles to sign the document without ever hearing his sister's furious objections. To truly understand why that vital consultation mysteriously disappeared, the story must return to the tense ceremony where fierce family loyalty violently collided with rigid royal authority, proving that the Crown's deepest crises are always fought behind closed doors. The confrontation produced explosive consequences within 40 hours, as palace lawyers hurriedly began drafting the final instrument of royal household closure, the formal, ironclad order that would legally dissolve Elizabeth's remaining offices and transfer all their lingering responsibilities. A documented revision showed that the decisive archive clause was inserted only after that bitter Windsor refusal, proving what had initially started as routine reorganization had now become an absolute test of raw power. William learned about the fire exchange through a confidential briefing, reading the recorded summary and immediately understanding the profound danger facing the institution. His father was desperately defending the Crown itself, while his aunt was passionately defending their family's sacred word. The ominous document would force both agonizing wounds into the exact same room, with zero escape routes remaining for either side. When Anne finally stepped into the king's private sitting room, neither sibling arrived even remotely prepared to surrender. No protective aid stood between them, and no private secretary softened the heavy language hanging in the air. Charles remained standing stiffly beside his massive desk while Anne entered carrying a well-worn copy of their mother's last household instruction. She did not sit down, and he stubbornly offered no explanation for several agonizing seconds. Brother and sister faced each other in a dense silence shaped entirely by heavy duty, profound grief, and decades of unspoken royal rivalry. Then, she forcefully placed the paper down before him and accused him straight to his face of closing Elizabeth's sacred door forever. Charles had summoned her immediately after discovering that she firmly intended to challenge the archive transferred directly before the Privy Council's reviewing officers. The Privy Council stood as the formal body of senior advisors serving the sovereign, and its powerful officers possessed the legal authority to examine whether the closure order had been prepared correctly under constitutional law. The instrument of royal household closure already waited ominously on his polished desk, but his signature remained glaringly absent. This high-stakes meeting offered one final, fleeting chance to amend it, delay it, or tear the royal family apart beyond repair, and pressed her firm palm against the printed instruction, the Princess Royal reminding him with cutting precision that Elizabeth's household had never been made of cold machinery, but of living, breathing people. Some loyal souls had served their mother devotedly through terrifying illnesses, unprecedented national crises, and the frail final days of her legendary reign. They thoroughly deserved a respectful, personal farewell. Instead, they were about to receive cold, impersonal legal notices informing them that their lifelong appointments had instantly vanished. Her voice trembled with suppressed emotion, yet she flatly refused to soften the razor-sharp accusation. Charles aggressively pushed his heavy mahogany chair back, declaring with visible frustration that he had spent every single day of his reign being unfairly measured against a monarch no successor could ever realistically replicate. Every delayed decision invited brutal public comparisons, and every unresolved disagreement actively encouraged palace officials to seek guidance from Elizabeth's ghost rather than his living authority. He loved his mother beyond measure, but preserving her towering shadow indefinitely was fatally weakening his reign and leaving the modern monarchy trapped permanently between two dead eras. And slowly opened a paper and pointed a steady finger directly at one handwritten sentence. Elizabeth had explicitly requested that private family correspondence remain under the shared, collaborative supervision of all her children. That crystal-clear instruction stood in direct, violent conflict with a new document's sole authority clause, which would place every single seal box under Charles's absolute, unshared control. His fierce sister demanded to know whether he had actually laid eyes on those specific words before initiating the process. The heavy silence that followed completely broke him. Charles finally admitted that he had read the handwritten instruction weeks earlier. He argued defensively that it merely expressed a mother's personal preference rather than a sovereign command capable of legally binding the next reign, and instantly recoiled in utter disbelief. To her, the distinction was both remarkably convenient and unforgivably cruel. Elizabeth had trusted all her children collectively as a family, and the reigning king was now weaponizing constitutional power to reduce that sacred maternal trust to a mere suggestion, and abruptly folded the instruction, stepped sharply away, and delivered a chilling warning. The final legal decision might legally belong to the monarch, but the devastating moral consequences would belong to the entire family for generations. Then, she deliberately spoke William's name, reminding him that the future king would forever remember whether his father had protected sacred unity or demanded blind obedience at any heavy cost. Charles watched her walk away without uttering a single word to call her back. The argument concluded behind a closed, heavy oak door, but the real, bruising struggle was already accelerating deep within complex machinery of the crown. Charles alone possessed the absolute legal power to dissolve the residual household. Yet senior officials desperately controlled which options actually reached his desk. They warned relentlessly that further delay would leave key appointments uncertain, charitable letters unanswered, financial reports hopelessly divided, and protected archives caught dangerously between two competing chains of command. The closure reached far beyond simple staffing. It would ultimately determine who controlled private correspondence, who approved unfinished charitable commitments, and whether Elizabeth's iconic royal cipher could still legally appear on new ceremonial papers. The cipher was a deeply personal emblem used universally to identify a sovereign's official work, and ending its active use would signal to every palace department that her authority had finally passed into history. William entered a private study while the document remained unsigned, telling his father plainly that the monarchy could not possibly build its vibrant future around unfinished mourning and confused authority. Still, He urged Charles to preserve his custodial role of the family archive, arguing that family trust could easily survive even when administrative power shifted hands. Charles heard his son's compassion, but he also felt crushing pressure. His son was no longer speaking purely as family. The future king was critically judging how this historic decision might be remembered when another succession eventually arrived. A confidential legal opinion delivered that very afternoon miraculously removed the final constitutional obstacle, confirming completely that Charles could claim the entire archive regardless of Elizabeth's handwritten preference. Yet, as Camilla proposed a clever compromise involving a private family panel for supervised access, Charles initially rejected it. Fearing every single exception would preserve the divided structure he was desperately trying to eradicate. Minutes before the official signing appointment, however, the king summoned his legal secretary and dictated one unexpected, massive concession regarding, and in the sealed boxes, a single altered paragraph that would determine whether the end and era would also completely shatter the royal family. The effects began immediately before the ink on the heavy parchment had even fully dried. Staff members who had loyally carried Elizabeth's intricate instructions to the turbulent final years of her life received cold, sealed notices informing them of their immediate termination. Her household seal was permanently removed from active use, and rows of locked mahogany cabinets were meticulously cataloged for swift transfer. And learned that the signature was finally complete while standing beside her car outside the palace gates. And for one exposed, agonizing second, the famously controlled Princess Royal closed her eyes tightly as though the solid ground beneath her feet had violently shifted. Change swept through the palace with ruthless, blinding speed. Final appointments expired. The late Queen's administrative office closed its doors for good, and its remaining duties passed directly and exclusively into the King's newly consolidated household. Those appointments have been official, authorized positions enabling staff to act with the sovereign's direct backing. Their expiration meant that every single unanswered letter, unfinished charitable promise, delicate ceremonial request, and protected historical record now belonged entirely to Charles's reign. Palace officials issued one final, unyielding instruction before sunset. Elizabeth's royal cipher could remain permanently on historic documents, royal gifts, ancient buildings, and physical objects connected to her lifetime, but could never again authorize new correspondence or fresh ceremonial orders. The iconic emblem would survive purely as history. It would never again function as raw political power. That razor-thin distinction made the entire closure impossible for anyone to dismiss as simple office reform, and gripped the car door tightly when William called to confirm that Charles had officially signed the decree, and the Princess Royal immediately asked whether her stubborn brother had adopted the original, uncompromised archive clause without any alterations whatsoever. The prince hesitated, and that brief, suffocating silence struck her harder and deeper than any harsh words could have. She fiercely feared that Elizabeth's private letters had been placed entirely beyond her reach, and that their sacred family trust had finally been swallowed whole by the crown. But William spoke quickly before she began the call, revealing through their confidential conversation that their father had dramatically changed the final page at the very last second. Charles would retain strict constitutional custody, meaning the strict legal responsibility to protect records connected directly to the sovereign's official duties, while Anne and her siblings would receive permanent, guaranteed access to family correspondence their mother had deeply intended them to share. Relief, however, did not instantly erase the deep emotional wound. A second vital provision guaranteed that Elizabeth's deeply personal letters as a mother could never under any circumstances be used for cheap royal publicity, political strategy, or tactical advantage in any future family dispute. Charles had successfully secured his absolute authority, while placing part of the archive beyond even his own political reach. Yet, and could never quite forget that he had executed the maneuver completely without her consent. Camilla watched quietly as an old household nameplate was permanently unscrewed and removed from its prominent place on the wall. The Queen Consort had desperately wanted a single, unified chain of command, but absolute triumph never arrived to fill the silence. She understood intimately that institutional success could closely resemble personal loss when history was physically disappeared piece by piece. Charles had finally achieved absolute clarity, yet he stood completely surrounded by haunting reminders of what that clarity had cost him in human terms, and finally released her white-knuckled grip on the car door and asked William to arrange one last, deeply private meeting with her brother. No officials, no slick lawyers, and zero documents standing between them. With the cold machinery of the institution finally settled, Charles and Anne were left alone to confront what no legal clause could ever hope to resolve: the raw, lingering pain between brother and sister. That quiet evening, Anne returned to the private apartments without the disputed instruction in her hand. Charles dismissed his final lingering aid and firmly closed the heavy oak door himself. There was no privy council to impress, no official record to maintain, and no sterile constitutional language left to hide behind. She stepped forward and asked him one poignant question. Had he signed the document because the monarchy desperately required it, or because living beside their mother's unfinished household had simply become entirely unbearable for him? For the very first time that momentous day, the king answered not as a distant sovereign, but purely as her brother. Charles remained completely silent for a long moment before admitting that both heavy reasons were undeniably true. The closure had become irreversible, leaving them free to finally strip away the armor they had worn for decades. Charles confessed that every unresolved file had slowly transformed into a silent judgment, and each unfinished instruction constantly reminded him that Elizabeth had successfully completed her monumental duty, while he was still struggling desperately to define his own reign. Her towering authority had once steadied him completely, but after her death, its lingering machinery made him feel like a temporary caretaker, forever waiting for permission to become fully sovereign. Then his voice cracked and faltered. The king admitted that he had delayed his signature repeatedly because dissolving the household felt like personally confirming that his mother was never coming back. As long as her loyal officials continued answering letters and protecting instructions, some vibrant part of Elizabeth still seemed actively alive within the palace walls. Signing the document meant ending that comforting illusion with his own hand. Anne's fierce anger slowly began to dissolve into shared sorrow. The Princess Royal confessed that she had defended the old structure for an equally private reason. Inside those remaining offices, she still felt profoundly like Elizabeth's cherished daughter. Everywhere else in the world, she was ruthlessly expected to serve the crown, support the new reign, and show zero personal uncertainty. The archive had preserved the last sacred place where heavy duty had not completely devoured family. Charles slowly moved toward his heavy desk and opened a small leather case. He revealed through this unrecorded, deeply private exchange that no senior advisor had ever proposed a permanent family access clause. He had inserted it entirely on his own initiative after sitting completely alone in the dark and rereading their mother's handwritten instruction. The harsh law had given him every right to completely ignore her preference, but he had consciously chosen mercy instead, and watched in profound silence as he reached into the case and removed the exact fountain pen used to sign the historic order. Charles gently placed the golden pen directly into her hand and asked her to keep it safely beside Elizabeth's private family papers. It was never meant to be a trophy. It was undeniable proof that although one sovereign had signed the final ending, the family would carry its complex meaning forward together. The siblings emerged into the dim corridor without exchanging a formal embrace, yet something fundamental and unbreakable between them had clearly shifted. William saw the historic pen gleaming in his aunt's hand and instantly understood its profound weight. The prince knew the upcoming public announcement could never sound like cold bureaucratic closure. It had to explain brilliantly why necessary endings were essential for royal continuity, and why moving forward into the future never required erasing the past. By the following sunrise, a deeply private act of profound grief transformed permanently into a public judgment on the true meaning of the modern monarchy itself.